Here are 9 mixing tips for wider mixes. You're going to learn how to take your mixes from this to this. So if you struggle to get wide, pro-sounding mixes that feel really immersive without resorting to stereo imaging plugins on your master, which can potentially ruin your mix, then keep watching. Towards the end of this lesson, I'll be revealing one of my very favorite tips for achieving width in your mix. And it involves a fun little exercise that we'll do together in real time. So be sure to stick around to the very end. Tip number 1, subtle tremolo. Tremolo is such a simple and effective tool for enhancing the width and depth of mono signals or already stereo sounds. It's one of the most underrated tools for width, in my opinion. This is something that should be more felt than heard, but you can go more dramatic with it depending on the situation. What it does is it helps create back and forth movement in the stereo field, which can be really effective when applied to pads, synths, reverbs, or anything more in the background, which contributes to the atmosphere of your music. Place any basic tremolo plugin at the end of your plugin chain on a track. Even if there's reverb directly on the track, it can really help you get the most out of this move if you put the tremolo dead last in the signal chain. That way your reverb isn't smearing the tremolo and losing the effect of that back and forth. Dial in the perfect amount of depth and rate depending on the instrument to create the back and forth movement in the stereo field. Let's enhance this already wide and spacious synth stab with some subtle tremolo. Here's the sound without. Listen to it in the context of the mix. And now listen with the tremolo. So what's happening here is the tremolo plugin is creating sort of a panning throw, much like you would create a reverb throw or a delay throw. It's taking the stereo field and moving it, right? It's taking this audio signal and moving that within the stereo field left and right to a degree that I set here by the depth knob. And I've got smoothing here at 100%, so it's a gradual kind of sliding from left and right. If I had this all the way to 0, it'd be super abrupt. So listen to that. I don't want that, so I have it smooth. And all the way 100% on the depth would go hard left and right, which I don't want because that would take it out of focus and lose volume and lose impact. All right, in the context of the mix, listen to this. But if I turn it down to 61 where I had it, much more subtle. And if I go even further with the rate knob slower, it's even more subtle and, in my opinion, more effective. I absolutely love this. It's more felt than heard, and it enhances an already wide sound even further and creates even more of a sense of like three-dimensionality. Is that even a word? And depth. Just be aware of how the depth knob can bring a sound out of focus or cause unwanted distraction if turned up too high. A good practice is to go too far, then dial it back until you feel this effect rather than hear it. Tip number 2, use mono reverbs and delays. The key here is to create contrast by using both wide and narrow reverbs and delays. The idea is that we achieve the most width in our mix when wide sounds are paired up against narrow sounds. It's the same concept with depth. Objects that are far away only really seem far away if there are other closer objects to contrast them with. For your sounds which have reverb or delay, simply have one or two of those elements sent to this mono reverb or delay, and the rest can be sent to stereo reverbs or delays. Here I have a ending sort of washy chorus pad. Listen to this sound here in the very outro. Okay, listen in context of the mix. Supposed to be super nice and distant, and this was just, it was kind of soupy, a little bit on the soupy end to me. And something interesting happened when I put in and blended this mono delay. This is a really classic old, one of the oldest, in fact, maybe the very first tape echo ever built. So this is an analog emulation by UAD. And if I turn this echo volume up, this is essentially acting like a wet dry knob. So these names are really old school. They're different from what we know parameter names to be today. So this echo repeats would be like the feedback, and then echo volume would be like the wet dry. So if I have no echo volume to here, it's all the way down, that would be completely dry signal. In this case, we would just only hear the sound, the original sound, right? Or at least it would be, maybe we'd hear a little bit of the coloration of this unit. But if I put this all the way up, you can hear it's a mono delay. Completely in the center, you can see that these two signals are exactly the same, which gives us mono. So when I pull this back to about here, we blend in the two, and then I have to gain match this because we lose a little bit of gain. So when I gain match this, I'm going to go ahead and toggle this on and off. Listen for how juxtaposing the original signal with this mono reverb, or sorry, mono delay, kind of opens up this sound. Here's off. On. Something's happening. I'm hearing it open up more. Turn up your headphones and listen one more time. Your headphones, your speakers, really turn them up to hear this. So here's off. One more time. I even hear it in the context of the mix. Let's go ahead and play without first. With. I feel like the mids almost clean up somehow. This is great. And you can do this kind of thing with, I mean, really anything that you want to create that contrast from the center and the sides. If you have a mix that you want to sound super spacious with lots of reverb, but don't want things to get too washy, try panning one of your main instruments with a reverb to one side and another instrument with a different tonal reverb to the opposite side. This way, both the sound with its reverb will be panned together to their respective sides. You can do this with either sends or directly on the track. Creating a send gives you a little more control over that effect, of course. Tip number 3, automate imaging from verse to chorus. For this tip, we'll once again create contrast from our verse to our chorus by automating stereo imaging or even panning. By narrowing down the stereo image of our verse or pre-chorus, we make our chorus or drop section appear much more wide and huge. Most DAWs should come with some kind of imaging or width plugin, but if not, there are plenty of free ones out there to accomplish this. Width by Boz Digital and Wider by Polyverse are both super easy to use stereo imaging plugins with one parameter, a width knob. However, there's a subtle difference between the two. The Boz width plugin can only narrow down and collapse a stereo image, whereas the Polyverse Wider goes beyond the original signal's stereo image. I'm going to use the standard stock Logic direction mixer to do this, to collapse the stereo image down to mono in this pre-chorus right before the chorus section. Let's go ahead and listen to this without these two. So you can hear at the tail end of this, there's like a little bit of a blip, and I think it's this sound here with some stereo info. Yeah, the end of this sweep sound, there's a little bit of stereo information that I'm now going to collapse down to mono with this direction mixer here. And then the other thing is the guitars. Lots of stereo info. Listen for how turning both of these on, collapsing it down to mono, and then having that open up in the chorus just makes that chorus sound that much bigger. Here's without. And then with. You can do that with any direction mixer or stereo image plugin, S1, Ozone 9, the Boz width plugin. You can't do it with the Polyverse Wider because that only allows you to go beyond stereo. There you have it. That's a quick and easy way to make your drop sound bigger, huge, more full. You don't have to have two instances of this like I do. I just did for whatever reason, since it's only two. You can actually throw this on the stereo bus and do it there. So you would want to have that as your first plugin on the stereo bus if that's where you were to do it. This is best accomplished towards the end of your production or mix session by placing your imaging plugin on the mix bus or groups of tracks. Before we get to the next tip, I wanted to quickly share some exciting news with you. We've partnered with Mastering the Mix to share free access to one of their most popular plugins with our YouTube community. The plugin is called Expose. It usually costs $65, and the basic premise of this plugin is that it will instantly tell you where the problem areas are in your mix or master. It can detect things like poor EQ balance, true peak clipping, over compression, phase issues, and other avoidable problems. You never know when your room is lying to you or when your ears are overly fatigued, and this plugin helps give you an objective view of how your track is going to perform out there in the world. To get this free plugin, all you have to do is join the mastering.com newsletter using the link in the description below, or you can scan the QR code you see on screen now. Go to that page, enter your details to join our newsletter, and then we'll email you a unique license code for the plugin along with instructions on how to install it. All right, pause this video now if you want to go do that, and then we can move on to tip number 4. Tip number 4, pan early and with context. If you're anything like me, making decisions about panning in the beginning of your journey can sort of paralyze you. After all, in Logic, you have 127 options for panning. Pro Tools has 100 positions on both left and right. What I highly recommend you do is lump your panning decisions in with your volume balance decisions when mixing. Practice making these decisions early and quickly before any processing is done on the track. If you're producing your own material, then you can do this in the production and or recording stage. stage. This should give you the majority of the width in your mix. The point is that it's done early on, not at the end. The important thing to consider is that panning and stereo placement should be genre specific. Here's a few helpful things to consider. The first thing to consider is regarding the style or genre. I keep it simple. For orchestral music, jazz, or anything with realism, simply pan based on how those instruments sit in the orchestra, band, or on stage. Simply Google orchestral panning chart and use that as a guide. And there's a bunch that will pop up that you can refer to. This kind of approach to panning can use up the entire stereo spectrum from hard left to hard right and everything in between. If it's not orchestral, jazz, or traditional acoustic instruments, then you can stick to LCR panning for most of your main instruments, vocals, guitars, lead synths, etc. The second thing is if you have stereo tracks that were created with a stereo pair of microphones, then you'll want to leave the panning for that stereo track in the middle because the recording engineer already panned the stereo pair of mics hard left and right for you and summed that into one stereo file. Think of overheads mic'd up with a stereo pair or even a piano with a stereo pair. You should keep this in mind when using samples as well. The third thing is that anything that contributes more to the atmosphere or background of the track, in other words, it's more of a supporting role, those can be placed anywhere in between left and center or right and center. Examples are hi-hats, toms, percussive elements, pads, background vocals, sound design elements, etc. To maintain stereo balance with these in-between elements, think about pairing supporting sounds opposite left and right of each other. So if one sound is panned 50% right, then consider panning another sound similar in timbre also 50% to the other side on the left. They don't have to be exactly the same, but close to. Try panning your main instruments that have plenty of body in the low mid-range, hard left and right, especially doubled guitars, vocals, and synths. By putting the most full-bodied part of the frequency spectrum out wide, we get a huge full and wide sound. At the end of the day, these are not hard rules, they're guiding principles and concepts. Feel free to do whatever you want with panning. Tip number 5. Use Haas delays. The Haas effect can be used to create a sense of spaciousness and stereo width in a mix without crowding. It's one of the quickest ways to add fullness to any sound. By panning a sound hard to one side, duplicating it, then delaying the duplicate by a few milliseconds and panning it to the other side, you create perceived stereo width. As long as the delay is within 40 milliseconds or so, you'll achieve this effect. You can use a sample delay, any stereo delay, chorus, or anything that duplicates, delays, and or modulates the duplicate signal. Some great third-party plugins that can do this are Microshift, Waves Doubler, Tal Uno Chorus, which is free, FabFilter, Timeless, Echo Boy, and a lot more. Set a Haas effect plugin on a send channel, otherwise known as an aux or bus. Before that effect, place an EQ and filter out the lows on only the mids. You can do this to your own taste. You don't have to filter out everything below 100 Hz. You can take it a little bit lower. Just pay attention to any negative phasing issues that might occur by using a correlation meter on the stereo out. Tip number 6, try stereo wideners on individual tracks. What we're focusing on here is typically enhancement with these tools. Different stereo wideners have slightly different algorithms for enhancing the stereo image of any audio signal. Some employ Haas, delay, or any number of processes that produce decorrelation. If you look at Sweetwater, they state that decorrelation is a process in which an audio source signal is transformed into multiple output signals with waveforms that are different from each other, but which sound similar. To do this, simply grab any stereo widening plugin and apply it to any track. Just Google top free stereo imaging plugins, and you'll see plenty worth using. Some paid third-party options are the Waves S1 Imager or Ozone 9 Imager. Let's go ahead and check out Wider by Polyverse as well as Ozone 9 Imager using the Stereoize function. It's set to about the same amount here and kind of compare these two. This is a baseline that we're going to apply them to. I have made sure that this isn't messing with any phase issues. You can use the vector scope to do that. Let's go ahead and play this dry without anything and see what this sounds like. Okay, here's in the context of the mix. So I want to give it a little bit more separation and width. Let's do that with the ozone imager first. I absolutely love that. So let's go ahead and see how it sounds with the wider. You have to have a really good pair of headphones on to really hear the difference, but they are subtly different. I've tried to match them in terms of like the percentage that their effect is at. So 38 and 38. They're both cool. They both add that additional sense of space and separation without actually using reverb or delay. I mean, I guess in a way they are using delay, but not in the way that delay would be used to really create a sense of like distance space or a lot of space. So let's hear that again with ozone. And off. On. It just feels bigger. It feels bigger without taking up any more space in the mix, which is really cool. That is a great way to add width to your individual tracks rather than trying to pull width out in the stereo out here. If we were to put ozone 9 here, then we'd be kind of throwing off the balance of our mix because it's going to be pulling apart, and that stereoize function would sort of pull apart the mix in a way that I wouldn't want. So you use that on individual tracks and you can accomplish that width without running into any, sort of like mix balance issues. Take the time to read the isotope manual on the ozone 9 imager. I'm serious. It's not a super lengthy or heady manual like most are, and you'll learn some cool things. Tip number 7, widen lows to low mids with saturation and chorus. As I mentioned earlier, widening the body of the frequency spectrum is a great way to create a huge, full, and wide sounding mix. All we're doing is taking the most full sounding part of the frequency spectrum and giving it maximum width using saturation and chorusing or any Haas effect. You can do this on guitar, bass, backing vocals, synths, or anything that occupies the 80 to 400 hertz range. Apply this to any of the main elements of your mix that occupy this full part of the frequency spectrum. Place your Haas effect directly on the track towards the end of the chain or on an aux return channel. Experiment with putting saturation either before or after the Haas effect that you're using. So I have this brass stab. Listen to this. Plenty of width already. I added some Valhalla room. Here's without the room. Here's with. Giving it a sense of space, 21%, very subtle with this kind of stuff to just give it, I'm just wanting to stretch it out a little bit in terms of space and width. Here's without. Okay, but the real thing I want to show you here is this chorus mixed with saturation. So on a send auxiliary channel that I called width, I'm cutting out all the lows and just the mids. So mids only, I'm cutting out everything up to 240. Then I added micro shift. You can copy these settings. It's really just 100% wet, standard, just sort of setting here. And then I've got Saturn after that. This is really doing a lot. So I'm going to go ahead and turn the send on and then crank this so you can hear this broken tube setting that I have here. So quite a bit. So here's pulled back to where I like it. Much more subtle. Here's no effect at all. I'm not sending anymore. And then with. So I think what's happening is that this saturation is kind of bringing out a little bit of this room sound as well, kind of beefing that up, really spreading that out. Listen, especially in the context of the mix, how much more intelligible this brass stab is with this on. I'm going to play without first, and then I'm going to bring it in. So here's without. And then here's with chorus and saturation. I love this. And we're not adding really any volume either. I've kind of gain matched things. Quite a big difference in my opinion. One more time, with and without. So here's without first. And then with. I could even probably pull that back a dB or so and not have it be that aggressive and have it still work. And without. With. Wider. Sounds bigger. Wider. I love that. To keep phasing intact, use any stereo imaging plugin that allows you to further narrow in specific frequencies. Place this at the very end of the channel strip on the track or aux channel. Narrow in the lows below 150 to your taste. Feel free to not go 100% mono with this. There are plenty of top charting, professional, modern mixes and productions that have plenty of stereo width in the information below 100 Hertz. Tip number 8, expand the sides of upper mids and highs. This can be done with any EQ or saturation plugin that offers mid-side processing. By isolating the sides from the mids, we can process only the side information with EQ, saturation, and enhance the sense of width to the track. Place a mid-side EQ or saturation plugin directly onto the track or groups of tracks that you want to affect. Make sure that the plugin is set to only affect the sides. This will look a little bit differently for different plugins. If you're doing this in the master or groups of tracks, I recommend that you operate on the more subtle side with your moves so that you don't throw off the balance of everything that you've worked so hard to achieve. If it's on an individual track, however, then feel free to be a little bit more aggressive with this move. But remember, in a lot of cases, a little can go a long way. So to expand the sides, you can simply take any EQ that offers mid-side processing and set that EQ on side mode. So I'm going to go ahead and do that for these two instances of the Pro Q3. I have a shelf, a high shelf from about 5K and up on both of them. This one's about 6.8K. This one's about 5.3. This one is on the outro guitar. So it's only happening on this biggest section here. Let's go ahead and play without, or I'll go ahead and isolate this track here. And then here's on the entire track.
Turn down the lights.
I want to get a little bit more kind of the attack of the guitar here because there's a lot of information on the sides that I can bring out. So if I turn this on, you'll hear a little bit of that. It's very subtle. I'm only doing about, 0.84 of a lift on the sides, and then there's an expansion that I'm doing with the dynamic kind of expansion going above 0. Turns this into sort of an expander. So that's about 1.9 dB in addition to the 0.8. So listen to this. Here's off. With. So it's subtle there, but when I combine it with putting a similar move on the stereo out, so this one's doing about 1 dB of static on the sides, and then another dB of dynamic expansion on the sides. So both of these together, you can definitely hear how that attack is coming out in the guitar a little bit more, and there's just an overall feeling of greater width. So let me pull this up again. We'll turn it off, hear it without, and then with. Again, here's without.
Burn the
And with.
burn the
Listen to all the high-end kind of percussive stuff mixed with that guitar.
burn the
The guitar comes forward a little bit more on the sides, and the percussive, high-end percussive elements come out a little bit more as well, which is giving us an overall feeling of just more expansion, more width. And finally, for my favorite of these tips is tip number 9. Pan reverbs and delays to opposite side. I want you to do something right now. Pause this video and listen to the first 13 seconds of Here Comes the Sun by the Beatles. I don't want to get a copyright strike, so just pause the video and go listen. Did you do it? Okay, now listen again to the same 13 seconds, but this time only listen to the left channel. If you're on headphones, just take the right ear out. If you're on speakers, then turn off the right speaker and listen. Then do the exact same thing on the other side and turn up the volume for the right speaker just a bit. Pause the video again and go listen. What you should have heard is a completely dry guitar sound on the left and a subtle amount of reverb or ambience on the right. Whether that's a chamber or room, I don't know, but the point is that there's a sense of width and space that we get with this method. The key is to simply have a completely dry instrument on one side and then pan a 100% reverb version of that instrument to the opposite side. In the Beatles example, the reverb on the right is very subtle, to the point where we hardly notice reverb. We simply notice a more three-dimensional sound. It's best to use a short reverb or delay to be more subtle, but feel free to experiment with longer delay or reverb times. There's two ways to do this. One is by panning your dry instrument to one side, then duplicate the track and pan that to the opposite side. Place a reverb or delay on your duplicate channel and put it at 100% wet so all you hear is the effect on that side. Play both together and bring down the wet signal until it's barely audible. From there, you can go either slightly up or down to taste. There you have it. I hope you've learned something new or interesting from these 9 tips. And remember that all these tips are best learned by practicing them, so be sure to try each of these methods out in your next mix or even production session. And I want to give you permission and even encourage you to go beyond what I discussed and demonstrated as far as plugin settings or moves. This way, you can learn for yourself what the boundaries are for you and your music, and develop an ear and personal taste for all of these things. And if you haven't done so already, be sure to check out my other video that I've done where we discuss the depth dimension, which is the front to back dimension of your mix. For this video, we covered the left to right width dimension, but in the video that should pop up on your screen now, I covered the depth dimension in great depth. So be sure to click on that if you want to level up your skill with taking your mixes to an even more immersive and three-dimensional level. Peace.